So I'm going to go over this article it's actually a peer-reviewed article that is an example um, based on the topic that you've been talking about with the librarian, the microaggressions topic. Um, so I want to use this article to go over a couple of things. She went through kind of how to dissect the article and what the different parts are. And I just want to use this example. I have some notes on here also just to kind of introduce what are some things you could do with this article. So I have this first section highlighted, and I sort of added that this is the introduction. And you'll notice this first part is really just kind of setting the stage for everything. That's sort of what the intro does. You're aware of that. It talks about a little bit about what kinds of research has been done, what the project is about, and sort of get into sort of what the problem is they're going to be addressing. And then here's where they get down to what the main point is, which is kind of what you expect, the introduction to do. Despite these notions, Canadian scholars have demonstrated that racism is commonplace in Canada generally and with Canadian universities specifically. So they're kind of going over what the problem is in Canada. That's where they are going to be conducting this study and doing this research. Given the unique Canadian context, the rapid influx of Asian students at Canadian universities, and the negative influence of racism on Asian international students' well-being, examining Asian international students' phenomenological experiences with racial microaggressions is critical. Such examination has the potential to ameliorate students' well-being, enhance campus racial climates, and to fulfill the aim of internationalization. So they're really kind of getting into what the goal is for this research. It's similar to what you're doing with the introduction to your annotated bibliography. What is the problem? What are we trying to figure out? Why is it important to look at this now? It's kind of getting down to the main point. I have a little typo. I'm just going to pull that. So I added this also. The next section serves as kind of a literature review. And what a literature review does is it looks at, we talked about the conversation in research being made up of lots of different texts. And what a literature review does is kind of what you're trying to get at with your anti-bibliography. Look at what literature is kind of standing out in the conversation, or at least in this case, in the specific part of the conversation that they're trying to look into. So they're going through what research has been conducted that is a foundation, that's a background for what they're wanting to do now. What kind of research has been done that's setting the scene that they're trying to build off of. So these next sessions, it starts with the racial microaggressions model, and they really get into the different types of microaggressions. So racial microaggressions, and getting down into the micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations, and sort of go through sort of that background. Here's the terminology that we're using, how we're breaking this term down, the different types of microaggressions that we're going to be going through. And you can see it's a literature review. It kind of gets into in a review of the literature. This study theorized potential racial microaggressions targeted at international students. So again, they're going through kind of some of the problems. And as you get here, I kind of wanted to note this because again, this point here brings everything together into kind of the main point, that what is still needed regarding the research, in this area. So it kind of sets up the need for the study that they have conducted. So this last point, finally, international students from all over the world are referred to as a homogeneous group. Thus, further empirical research is necessary to provide a more nuanced and complex portrayal, words today, right, of specific international students' experiences of racial microaggressions. So this also, when they get to the end of these sections, they're kind of bringing everything again back to that point that they're trying to make, the reason for their research, and kind of making a point that ties everything together back to the main point, but is also specific for what they're talking about in that section. So it doesn't sound like they're rambling, they're bringing everything back. And one of the things you can do with these articles is look at specifically the first couple of sentences, these headers, the first couple of sentences of these sections, and even the last sentences, to look for kind of those main points that you might be able to use, and at least tell you if that section is going to be useful. Because a lot of times like this you can see would be great for some background information. These main points are things that you could kind of come back to as well. As we get in, we see like a ton of studies that would be really useful, even if you're just kind of branching out and looking for other things to read. Again, they're continuing with this kind of literature review in this next section, although there exists a host of literature on coping with racism, and it kind of gives you some citations to some of these other things. Again, continues like purpose and rationale of the present investigation. So again, like if you read this first sentence, with few exceptions, the majority of studies focusing on Asian international students' experiences consider all students as one homogeneous group at the expense of important factors such as country of origin. Most often, they have excluded South Asian students. So we're again getting, like, as you read these main points and you get into these sections, they get further and further into it. And one kind of talking about how often in research, what they're saying is that they treat international students as one group without considering the nuance and the complex circumstances of being from different countries, not just being international as one group. And so they're really looking at the issue of South Asian students in Canada for this study. And what you'll notice with studies is that they do get super specific. It's always looking at like this one group or this one variable in this one location. So these studies do tend to really be about the like super specific research that people are conducting. Here, I think this is interesting because one of the things we're doing is breaking down our big question and kind of see what their big goal is. And they also list here, before they get into the method section, research questions that they would like to try to answer through this study. So you kind of read through those. I'm not going to do much with the methods section. This is where you might get some of the conditions of the study. If you want to describe or you want to use this study as a source, you might go through and pull like the setting, researchers, how the interviews were conducted, some of the main points from this to talk about in your paper, because anytime you're pulling information from a study, it's important to talk about how the study was conducted so readers know if it's trustworthy or not. But a lot of times this is the really specific stuff like you see up here, participants and procedure, and you get into, often this is where it gets really discipline specific, where if you're not an expert in this particular field, you might be a little bit lost in understanding what to do with some of this data. So a lot of times you may, if you can figure out, like, read some of the information that they talk about with the graphs, you might be able to use those and use those as data. But the results section is often a good place to pull stuff from, because that's where they draw your conclusions. You have the introduction, like what the topic is about, the literature review where they talk about all the previous studies and literature that's out there. You have the method section that talks about how they conducted the study. The results then says the results, like here's what we drew, here's the conclusions we drew from the study and how we're going to explain it. And so you can kind of go through like with the results and see a couple of things. So I highlighted a couple of points. 6 East Asian students and 1 South Asian international students typically reported feeling excluded. So they kind of go through what some of the things were that they drew from this study. For instance, some discuss being excluded from common areas of social interaction among peers, especially white peers. If you're looking for like quotable points to make and data that, or at least not data, but explanation that's going to help you interpret the data, help you interpret this kind of stuff, this is kind of where you would go. You would go to the results section and pull these main points, because this says, here's what the study showed, and here's some details from it. So this would be these kinds of things would be a good things to pull from this section. I wanted to highlight this because if you notice, this has come up a lot, this study, and this is what I would consider a foundational text. I've used that term a couple of times. It's a text that, when I say foundational, it's not just something that's cited, but it's something that they're really relying on. It's a very important study that's widely cited and creates the foundation for the conversation. Keep on scrolling down, you get the idea with the results section. The discussion is where they talk further about it. In the discussion section, it's not just where they're saying what the results are, like here's exactly what everything is. This is where all of their like interpretation and what they can do. What can we do with the results? Based on the results that we got from this study, what do they show and how do they connect to the problem and how can they help us solve the problem? Like, what can we do with this information? That's often what the discussion is for. And this is an excellent place to pull stuff from for papers. Especially if you are not an expert in this field and you just need to get a scholarly source, or you want to get an expert but you need the digestible part of the article, go to the discussion. And in addition, sorry, I think I missed something here. Okay, yeah, so this is a good part here. Findings from the current study extend prior research by documenting differences in experiences of racial microaggressions on the basis of students' intersecting social identities. So this notes in further details what their study adds to the conversation, and I think that kind of illustrates also what the discussion section does. Like, it takes the results and it ties it back to the conversation. Here's what these results add, and here's what they let us see and understand for the problem as a whole, and so we can see what we can do with it. And again, kind of the last part of this discussion section is implications for practice, which really does kind of get into the here's what we can do with it. So this subsection gets into ideas for what should be done to improve this issue. The conclusion is another great place to pull like summative points. So this first sentence I highlighted, the present study offers one of the first empirical examinations of international students' experiences with racial microaggressions and subsequent coping responses. You can see as we're going through this one, all of this disciplinary specific language. So if you aren't familiar, if you're writing about this and you're not familiar with I'm going way back to the beginning here, some of these terms that I brought up in the background, so like the micro insults, micro invalidations, micro assaults, these would be things that you would maybe want to look up and know to provide some background. But there's a lot of this terminology that you might need to know and look up. Internationalization, homogenous, some of these terms that they kind of throw around. Let's see. Oh, sorry, going back down to the conclusion. So note that they bring up multiple times what the goal of the study is, what it adds to the conversation, what it talks about what it talks about the previous literature doesn't, and what it calls into question. So what they really are doing is kind of threading throughout the whole article, like what this study is for, what its goals are, more specifically, like what it reveals about the current conversation, what the study adds to it. So they're threading it kind of throughout, so you kind of understand, like, as you're reading, like, it always comes back to the main point. And that's a really good strategy, and that's what you want to make sure that you are doing kind of as we move into the digital essay. You're going to be breaking your essay up into sections and just making sure that we understand how each section ties to the point that you're making, and that's kind of what they do here. And again, look at all these sources. Like, really, look at all these sources. All the potential sources for further research, for background. It makes things, a lot easier on you. So I want to show you, now that I've kind of showed you a little bit about what you maybe could think about doing or using those sections for with an example on a topic you might be familiar with, because the librarian uses it quite often, is I want to go to this in our database and show you a couple of things to keep in mind as you're picking your article for this activity. One, you have this peer-reviewed stamp. If you look over here on the availability when you search, you can check peer-reviewed and apply that filter. You can check for resource type article. So there are things you can do to kind of narrow it in, but what you want to make sure first is that it has this journal has been peer-reviewed. Now I'll say this, that doesn't, just because it has the peer-reviewed stamp doesn't mean it's an article. It just means it's in a peer-reviewed journal. Remember, a journal is like a magazine, and it has a lot of types of articles. You might have editorials and news, and those are not what we're using. It must be an article. Now, this does actually say article up here, but a lot of things will that are also editorials and things like that. One of the things you can do, or a couple things you can do first, when you pull this up, it's going to take you to the place where you can access it. So full text available here, but just keep in mind you also have like citation information to help you out with that. It takes you to EasyBib, ReferenceWorks, your permanent link to this source. If you need help, it gives you lots of other like subheadings you can use to search for things. And here's what you want to make sure you also look for when you pull up this article and it gets done thinking. What you want to make sure you look at as you go to this information. All the stuff you need for your citation should be here. But if you go down, it says document type, journal article. That means you have the right type of source. If it says editorial, or it says news, or it says something blog, it says something other than article, it's not the right genre. If you're looking through it again and it looks easy to read, it looks fun, it looks super interesting, you've picked the wrong genre. To be honest, these are very disciplinary specific. They're written by experts for experts. They're very research heavy. They should look long. They should look boring, or at least not super thrilling, you know. And they should look very formal, and they probably should look intimidating because they have very specific, very disciplinary specific information and language. So they should, if you're looking at this article that you've picked and you're like, man, this is really interesting, and it's only like 3 pages, I'll so like blow through this. This is very engaging. It's the wrong article. It should look, again, long, boring, kind of scary, or at least not like super fun or thrilling, you know. So just make sure you're double checking this. And again, as I said, if you're not sure, you can always post to the coffee shop, and either, you know, me or a peer will take a look at it and let you know something.